On the Yauza River, they tested an old and decrepit English boat that the Tsar had unearthed in Izmailovo, among all sorts of junk. The boat swayed lazily back and forth on the sleepy water. Suddenly, with a rustle, the sail unfurled. And it was as if some strange, strong force had seized the ship. The rigging creaked, and spray flew into his face. Battle flags flew, and mighty cannons thundered, shrouding huge ships in smoke. There, far beyond the horizon, where the young Tsar rode precariously in a small riverboat. Thanks to Peter the Great's iron will, Russia would become the only country in the entire world to build a navy literally from nothing at all. In the span of only one human lifetime, it would amazingly make up for 300 lost years.
First of all,
but the Tsar is not eternal.
We'll hire workers, invite
Who will
specialists from
continue
Holland.
the great reforms when he is dead and gone? To whom should he pass his legacy? His army,
Mainmast.
his navy, his empire?
Main.
For many years, the sovereign would hang all his hopes on his son, Alexei. However, fate would decree otherwise. The history of the Russian Navy began together with the history of the state. When the legendary Prince Rurik came from across the sea with his formidable warriors riding on battleships. For many centuries, Slavs had built riverboats, which were flat-bottomed vessels with steep sides. In the White Sea, Russian pomors hunted fish and sea animals on sailing coke boats. Their hull was shaped much like a walnut shell, so that the ice would not crush the vessel, but would push it up to the surface. But European shipbuilding of the time had made a giant leap forward. Three-masted ships carried enormous cargoes, easily withstanding ocean storms. Seafarers were discovering new lands. 150 years before Peter the Great was born, Ferdinand Magellan had already completed the first circumnavigation of the globe. The Russian kingdom remained powerful, but it was landlocked. Access to the Baltic Sea was blocked by Sweden, while access to the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea was blocked by the Ottoman Empire. By the time Peter ordered the establishment of a shipyard on Lake Pleshcheyevo, Russian shipbuilding was an entire 300 years behind European shipbuilding. Meanwhile, the young Tsar spent all of his free time on Lake Pleshcheyevo. He worked as a carpenter and personally supervised the digging of the canal. He was briefly distracted from his favorite pursuit by his marriage to Evdokia Lopukina and the birth of his firstborn, Tsarevich Alexei. But Peter, who himself was actually only 18 years old at the time, did not yet see his little son as an heir to the throne. And he hadn't thought about the succession yet, because there were more pressing matters. As soon as the rivers opened up, the Tsar hurried to the lake in order to prepare the very first Russian flotilla for its maiden launch. 12-year-old Alexander Menshikov tagged along with the Preobrazhensky regiment, where many of his older comrades served. His comrades told him to sit still and keep his head down. But how could he just sit there?
Yes, well done.
There in the distance, the sovereign's voice rang out. Launch.
Launch!
One after another, boats as large as peasant huts were launched. And then, the mock army approached and greeted the mock flotilla. Meanwhile, maritime powers ruled the world. The might of the British and Ottoman empires, along with the wealth of Holland, Spain, and Portugal, were all based on maritime trade. The Russian kingdom had only one seaport, Arkhangelsk on the White Sea. Caravans of merchant ships came there only during the hot summer months, when the ice retreated.
Russian trade resembled colonial trade. They exported furs, wax, honey, hemp, flax, valuable fish species, caviar, timber, and grain. They imported weapons, fabrics, and luxury goods. Terms and prices were dictated by visiting merchants. This meant there was foreign control over foreign trade. Peter understood that economic control would be followed by political control.
The Russian Tsar traveled to Arkhangelsk in order to see real seagoing ships with his own two eyes. Both English and Dutch ships saluted the small vessel on which Peter and his retinue were traveling. And the sailors, they looked condescendingly at the Muscovite Tsar. Peter ordered them to dock alongside a huge frigate. He climbed everywhere. He grabbed everything with his hands, peppered them with questions in broken Dutch. An upstart young officer inquired as to why His Tsarist Majesty actually needed to know how a ship was built and operated. And why? Because I want to build ships just like these. No, not like these. I'll build them bigger and better. Russia is going to fight wars at sea, and that means that we most definitely need a navy. In late April of the year 1695, 22-year-old sovereign Peter Alexeyevich set out with his army on a campaign against the Turkish fortress of Azov, which blocked access to the Sea of Azov as well as the Black Sea. And 7 months later, he returned to Moscow alone. The defeated Russian army moved slowly across the cold, frozen steppes. But Peter already had a plan. The besieged fortress was supported by the Turkish fleet, supplying the garrison with weapons and provisions. Having no ships, the Russians could not interfere with the Turks, which meant that creating their own fleet was no longer a childhood dream, but an urgent necessity. The games were over. The work had begun. In Voronezh, on the banks of a tributary of the Don River, they established a large shipyard where craftsmen were brought from all over the country. Peasants from neighboring villages were rounded up to cut timber. A war galley that was purchased in Amsterdam was delivered in disassembled form to Preobrazhenskoye, located near Moscow. There, they copied all its components and then sent them to Voronezh.
A galley is a sailing and rowing vessel with a long, narrow hull and shallow draft. Armament consisted of 1 to 3 cannons on the forward platform and 1 to 2 light cannons in the center of the deck. They had 2 or 3 masts, usually with triangular lateen sails. Rowing speed was 6 to 8 knots, which comes out to about 11 to 15 kilometers per hour.
By order of the Tsar, secular and church landowners were united into partnerships called kumpanstva, and they jointly financed the construction of ships. The kumpanstva also included foreign specialists that were hired. Hundreds of carpenters under the direction of Dutch and English supervisors were building the galley fleet. They lived in barracks, in cold and dampness. The death rate reached up to 100 people per day. Those who tried to escape were caught and hanged. The work was poorly organized. The hastily hired foreigners turned out to be far from the best specialists. Ship timber deteriorated under the open sky, while the kumpanstva sought to reduce their expenses, sometimes buying poor quality raw materials on the cheap.
By April of the year 1696, in just a few months, they built 23 galleys. The 36-gun ship Apostle Peter, 2 fire ships, and 1,300 strugs, which were large boats for transporting infantry.
Contrary to fears, not only did the ships not sink, but they confidently set out on the campaign. They did make it, though with difficulty, as they had to stop repeatedly for repairs. But in the year 1696, the formidable Russian flotilla in all its glory appeared in the Sea of Azov. The Turks could not believe their eyes. Their fleet, upon seeing the Russian galleys, did not dare enter the bay. Azov was placed under complete siege from both land and sea. On July 18th, the fortress garrison capitulated, without an assault. On a rocky cape that was called Taganrog, Peter chose a site for a harbor, and it was this same harbor that was to become the very first Russian naval base. Peter considered the Sea of Azov only a bridgehead for advancing into the Black Sea, and perhaps even beyond.
We'll invite specialists from Holland.
Always
got
busy
it.
with state affairs, the Tsar had not seen his son
The
for
logs
years.
arrive, we'll decide then, all right?
Yes, okay,
Alexei
got it.
grew up
First.
as a withdrawn and
Second,
distrustful child,
Hire workers.
Yes,
and
understood.
influenced by his mother's
We'll
circle.
invite specialists
He
from
could
Holland.
not stand
Yes, got
anything
it.
associated with Peter's name, nor with his reforms.
Second,
Unlike his father,
Yes, all right.
the Tsarevich showed no enthusiasm
understand
for
me?
either
Yes, I
practical matters
understand.
or sciences.
Yes.
And when teachers were sent to him, he would beat them with a stick and drag them by their hair. It was then that Peter ordered the very best foreign teachers to be brought for his son. However, even they failed to make the heir come to his senses. In one of his letters, Peter wrote, "God has not deprived you of reason." The Tsarevich truly had enough ability to master the wisdom of the sciences being studied. But Alexei's mind was exceptionally passive, and it was lazy as well. Unlike his father, who, to obtain the necessary knowledge, did not hesitate to go to Holland himself as part of the great embassy. The official purpose of the great embassy was to find allies against the Ottoman Empire, while the unofficial purpose was to recruit shipbuilders and sailors for the Russian fleet. The Tsar traveled incognito, under the name of Sergeant Peter Mikhailov, as part of a group of volunteers. The very small town of Zaandam was one of the great centers of Dutch shipbuilding. Here, 50 shipyards worked, both day and night. A medium-sized ship was built in only 6 weeks. That's why Peter sought to come here. He wanted to learn how to build ships himself. Peter stayed with an old acquaintance, blacksmith Garrett Kist. Kist had previously worked in Moscow. That same day, the Tsar bought tools, glasses, and he hired himself out as a carpenter at a private shipyard. Then he moved to Amsterdam. At the ceremonial meeting, the burgomaster informed Peter that in his honor, the frigate Holy Apostles Peter and Paul had been laid down at the East India Company shipyard, 100 feet long.
A sailing frigate is a 3-masted warship, and it has full sail rigging. Unlike galleys, it had a wide hull and deeper draft, and because of this, it was more stable. Artillery armament of up to 44 guns was positioned on gun decks along the sides of the ship. Frigates were built only at shipyards that specialized in their construction. First, every last part of the ship was drawn to full scale. On the slipways, vertical stems and beams were attached to the keel, and both ribs and frames were installed as well. Then the frame was planked both on the inside and on the outside, and all gaps were sealed. To protect against rot, the bottom was treated with a hot mixture of resin and tar. Crossbeams, called deck beams, were installed, on which the deck was laid. And then gun ports were cut into the sides. After that, the rigging and the masts were installed, and then the tackle, rope system, and sail equipment were all mounted.
Peter worked in Amsterdam for 3 months. After he had completed these 3 months, he received a certificate from shipmaster Gerrit Klaas. I hereby certify truly that Peter Mikhailov has studied ship architecture and the drawing of plans thoroughly. And he now knows as much as we ourselves and understands these concepts. It was at this point that Peter persuaded Cornelius Cruys to go to Russia. Cruys was a Norwegian captain and he was very well known among Dutch sailors. On April 9th of the year 1698, Cornelius Cruys entered Russian service. In the same year, soldier Alexei Semenov of the Bombardier Company of the Preobrazhensky Regiment also began service. Once again, Alexei reread his brother Ivan's letter. He wrote that having joined a Dutch ship as a sailor, he had already seen France and Denmark. And now, following the sovereign, he was planning to go to England. Is that how it is? Your brother gets to study the sea, while you, Alexei, march until you're blue in the face and water the cannons. Peter completely and utterly failed to find allies in the war against the Ottoman Empire. But on his way back to Russia, the Tsar agreed with Polish King Augustus to jointly act against the Swedes. Plans changed. The Tsar was now going to fight not for the Black Sea, but for the Baltic Sea. Despite having failed in its diplomatic mission, the Great Embassy succeeded quite well in its second task. Hundreds of foreign specialists, shipbuilders, gunsmiths, and navigators were all heading to Moscow. Cornelius Cruys arrived in Voronezh. He inspected the shipyard and then he reported to the Tsar that everything had to be started over. The ships that were built are only good for firewood, and timber should only be dried in covered sheds. It is crucial to use iron nails. It is also important to feed the workers meat and build houses for them. And be sure to hire good craftsmen instead of bad ones. There were dozens of more demands, conditions, and instructions. Peter considered it impossible, but the stubborn sailor stood his ground. During spring, under his leadership, 58 ships were repaired, and 60 new ones were laid down. The companies were abolished, and instead, a unified tax for ship construction and repair was introduced. Thus, 500 kilometers from the sea in Voronezh, a huge ship factory began operating, using the exact same model on which the rest of the country's shipyards would grow. Fyodor Matveyevich Apraksin took charge of the enterprise. He was one of the creators of the Russian Navy, as well as the first president of the Admiralty Collegium, which was the supreme governing body of naval affairs. In addition, Peter himself drew up the project for the country's main shipyard, the St. Petersburg Admiralty.
In the courtyard were located the boathouses, facilities for ship construction with slipways. The slipways were inclined platforms for launching ships into the water. Nearby dry docks were being built, basins with gates. The ship was brought into the dock, placed on supports, and then water was pumped out of the basin. As a result, workers gained access to the exterior of the hull for repairs. The building itself housed warehouses, workshops, forges, and various services.
Occasionally, the sovereign would visit Preobrazhenskoye. Ever since his wife Evdokia was imprisoned in a monastery by his order, his son Tsarevich Alexei behaved like a wolf cub. Peter understood. He held a grudge over his mother. But there was something else. Something alien in his gaze. And he couldn't decipher it. Peter tried to captivate his son with stories of distant voyages and naval battles. But he would look away, either counting crows outside the window or plotting something sinister.
Mainmast!
War, the formation of the army, and the construction of the fleet remained the Tsar's primary concerns.
Top-gallant sail! Gaff!
And Peter would leave, just as suddenly as he had appeared. In the year 1699, the Azov flotilla set out on the Kerch campaign. The goal was to demonstrate the great strength of the Russian fleet to the Ottoman Empire. The ship, where the Tsar himself served as captain, bore the name Open Gates, and its sailors were actually all soldiers from the Preobrazhensky regiment. Among them was Naum Sinyavin. Yesterday's soldier found it hard to get used to his good fortune. His palms, rubbed raw and bloody by the ropes, ached, but most frightening of all, his knees trembled with excitement when the boatswain ordered him to climb the mast. Little did he know, young Sinyavin was being watched by the sovereign Peter Alexeyevich himself. Like climbing tree branches, Naum scrambled up the ropes step by step, not ever looking down. Higher and still higher. When he reached the top-gallant yard, the Tsar broke into a satisfied smile. Well done, sailor. And although Naum was already standing 12 fathoms above the water, his great happiness could not be contained in his chest. In the distance, he saw the sea. Initially, ship crews were completely staffed by foreigners, as well as officers and soldiers from the Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky regiments. Officers gave their subordinates the orders in Russian, Dutch, and English. Then the fleet began recruiting soldiers, most often from the Arkhangelsk province, since the Pomors had known the sea since childhood. By the year 1700, at least 1,000 Russian sailors served in the fleet. And by the year 1725, there were no mercenaries left among the lower ranks at all. But the terminology remained exclusively Dutch, and this is one of Peter's traditions that exists to this day.
All naval terms, including mast, yard, rigging, tackle, topmast, and hundreds of others, are distorted Dutch words. So the famous word polundra, meaning watch out, comes from the Dutch val onder, which literally means falls down. This was how they warned about falling cargo or mast debris during battle.
According to regulations, a sailor was supposed to take 5 years to master the ship's structure. But in practice, training happened faster. Each recruit chose an uncle from among the veterans, and that uncle taught him the naval profession. The young sailor nephew would wash his uncle's clothes and would also run errands for him. The most agile of all the sailors were assigned as topmen, and they would work at great heights. They climbed the shrouds in both calm weather and storms, moved along the yards, and also furled and set sails.
Begin!
The brightest of them would become helmsmen. They learned the compass points, knew how to steer by them, and maintained the indicated course. All sailors had to tie knots, splice, which means to join torn ropes without visible knots, sew sails, and handle boats both under oars and sail, and much more. Sailor Naum Sinyavin went through several battles. He was severely wounded, and at the age of 28, he rose to the rank of lieutenant. He was already commanding a 2-masted galley as part of the rowing flotilla, which was guarding the approaches to St. Petersburg. The flotilla's mission was set by Tsar Peter himself, to prevent the Swedes from crossing the Neva in the area of the Tosna River. But they began building fortifications upstream, and all the Russian ships went there. At Tosna, they left a detachment of dragoons and 2 galleys on duty. One was commanded by English officer Lawrence, and the other was commanded by Naum Sinyavin. He peered into the fog and, to his horror, he realized The Swedes, having deceived the Russians, began their crossing.
Load!
Both ships rushed toward the shore. The Swedish shore battery opened fire, and the first cannonballs crashed into the hull. Lawrence turned around and simply left, leaving Sinyavin all alone.
To the left!
A cannonball knocked down the mainmast. The galley's bow cannons grew red hot. The vinegar for cooling the barrels completely ran out. And then, all the gunpowder was gone. To show cowardice, to fail the Tsar's trust, that was worse than death. Then Naum gave his sailors the command to go ashore. The rowers and sailors seemed to transform into infantry of the Preobrazhensky regiment.
Come on, brothers, forward!
Lieutenant Sinyavin
Keep going,
led his crew into battle. This attack forced the enemy to abandon their campaign against St. Petersburg. But Russia was not yet ready to confront the Swedes, who were very strong at sea. Having decided to create a navy, Peter sent 35 young nobles abroad where they would get training. And in 1701, he founded a school of mathematical and navigational sciences in Moscow. Nevertheless, annually young men from the most noble families were sent to Holland, England, and Spain, where they would get maritime training. Despite Peter's best efforts, the young nobles were not overly eager to go into heavy naval service. Besides, it was known that Russian midshipmen abroad lived quite poorly. They told about it themselves in letters they sent home.
Master, it's time to get
Kana
up.
paid for both tuition and maintenance.
How dare you?
But the money came with long delays. The young men hung around the city looking for a part-time job.
Get out.
Every now and then they would get into unpleasant stories, trouble. Maxim Safariev, the son of a Kaluga landowner, took a servant with him to Holland, a Kalmyk
Answer
boy
me, what's wrong
whose
with you?
name was Dennis. Maxim led a merry life,
To the left.
while his servant studied and went to
that's
sea.
it.
On their return, the officers were examined by the
Answer
Tsar
me.
himself.
Where is the mainmast?
Safariev, as for
Your
him,
Majesty.
well, he didn't know anything at all. When Dennis began to prompt the
right
master,
there.
Peter noticed it, and he took to examining the servant.
All right, show
Out
me.
of 50 people, only 10 people managed to pass the exam, and
Mainmast.
that included Dennis.
Main. Topsail.
Peter ordered Spafariev to be enrolled as a sailor, and what became of him is unknown.
Gaff.
And Denis Peridonovich Kolmikov will become a captain. He will receive nobility, and he will serve to the counter-admiral and commander of the port of Kronstadt. Thanks to Peter's efforts, Russia was raising the very first generation of its own naval leaders. And one of them was Naum Senyavin. In signing the order appointing him to be a captain, the Tsar did not doubt his decision. And Naum, receiving the document from the sovereign, could not believe his luck. Captain, a full-blown commander, king and god to the entire crew. He is responsible for the fate of both the ship and the entire crew. He enters the fray.
At
He
your
is the
command.
last to leave the deck, in the tragic event of a shipwreck. A ship is also a huge household, and there are mountains of orders, statements, and money boards on the captain's shoulders. Everything, from cannon and powder to the last breadcrumbs and piece of rope, must be counted, checked, written down, and put in its place. Having lined up the crew, the captain heads out to inspect the ship, going into its depths where sometimes even sailors don't go.
The lower ranks were located in the forecastle, that is, the bow. The infirmary and galley, the ship's kitchen, were also located there. At night, hammocks made of sailcloth with hooks were hung in the lower deck compartment. In the morning, the bunks were folded up, and then they were stowed in bunk nets along the sides. The stern section was for officers. It housed the wardroom, the officers' mess hall, and the lieutenants' quarters. The midshipmen huddled in a small enclosure. Next door to them is the ship's chaplain and the doctor. Only the captain was entitled to private quarters of his own. A separate sealed powder chamber contained many tons of gunpowder. And of course, emergency and firefighting measures were taken on wooden ships. The permission of the watch officer was required in order to light the lanterns and the stove. Smoking was allowed only during the day on the tank, near the water jet. Special safety lights were lit in strictly designated locations only. The holds contained supplies of drinking water and provisions, salted beef in barrels, crackers and cereals, butter at the waterline, which acted as a natural refrigerator. For very long voyages, livestock and poultry were taken on board, and they were transported in stalls and cages. There was always water splashing in the very depths of the hold. Unfortunately, all the wooden ships were leaking, and the ship carpenters made sure that the water level did not exceed the permissible level.
By order of the Tsar himself, Captain Lieutenant Naum Senyavin took the battleship Devonshire under his command. While the loading was going on, the commander was doing paperwork. Then someone special came aboard, Adjutant General Anton Daviller. He was Peter's favorite, Menchikov's son-in-law, and an important person in general. He was unaccustomed to objections, and he began to reprimand Senyavin from the start. He said that Senyavin was making a mess of the ship. But Peter did not train his captains in such a way that they would listen without complaint to comments from outsiders, whoever they may be. The unhappy victim later wrote to Peter's office secretary, who was Alexei Makarov.
Can you imagine?
I have had to be on bed rest for over a week, and I cannot turn over from the terrible beating I got. Daviller did not dare to actually complain to the sovereign himself.
Gentlemen, cheers!
Meanwhile, Peter's new wife, Catherine, gave birth to the Tsar's two daughters, Anna and Elizabeth. 19-year-old Alexei, the son from his first marriage, remained the only contender for the role of heir to the throne. But would he be able to continue his father's endeavors? The prince spent more time enjoying wild parties over a glass of wine than anything else. In order to introduce his son to affairs of state, Peter gave him his very first serious assignment: to supervise the construction of fortifications in Moscow in case the Swedes decided to invade. As was later reported to the Tsar, the heir did not spend even half an hour at the post entrusted to him. He looked around absent-mindedly, nodded his head, and then he rode off to his companions. Peter was beside himself with rage. He was sometimes lenient toward others' mistakes, but he never forgave a lack of diligence. He called his son in for a talk, scolded him, and appealed to his sense of duty. It would even have come to blows had Catherine not intervened in time. Only she managed to resolve the conflict. However, as soon as Peter left, his son was once again in the company of his friends. While diligently building the Russian fleet, the Tsar personally sketched the design of the St. Andrew's flag. On sailing ships, the length of the flag reached 4 meters, and in the wind, the banner roared like a siren. To lower the stern flag during a battle would have meant surrendering the ship, which was of course unthinkable. Captain Sinyavin's ship of the line Devonshire was entering the port of Hamburg when suddenly a local convoy sloop came to meet it. According to naval custom, all vessels must salute a warship that is flying the national flag. This is done by lowering their pennant. However, this sloop was in no hurry at all to salute the St. Andrew's flag. Captain Sinyavin signaled, demanding a salute to the Russian flag. The insolent German replied, "I don't recognize such a flag."
Weapons ready for
Sinyavin then
battle.
summoned the artillery officer.
Prepare the guns for battle. Load it up. Gunpowder. Ramrod. Cannons at the ready. Fire! Fire!
2 Russian cannonballs flew past. The third hit the sloop's hull squarely, and its pennant fell into the water. From now on, remember that there is a Russian St. Andrew's flag. Captains of different nationalities sailed under the St. Andrew's flag. Peter needed experienced sailors, and the Tsar was not interested in their past. Thus, the Serbian corsair Matija Zmajevic, who was the scourge of the Turkish fleet, was ransomed from prison in Constantinople by the Russian ambassador. Peter personally examined the sailor, and he immediately promoted him to the rank of captain first class. Zmajevic expertly handled galleys, and it was on the galley fleet that Peter placed his main bet in the naval war with Sweden. In the Baltic skerries, narrow, shallow bays, galleys proved more effective than large ships. On June 21st of the year 1714, the Russian rowing fleet that was under the command of General Admiral Apraksin met a very powerful Swedish squadron belonging to Admiral Vatrang at Cape Gangut. Tsar Peter and Apraksin looked through their spyglasses for a long time, and they counted the enemy pennants. After much thought, they decided to make a portage in order to drag some of their galleys to a neighboring fjord. Admiral Vatrang sent 10 ships with the aim of intercepting the Russians. But Peter canceled the dragging of the galleys. He waited until the wind was completely calm, and when the Swedish sailing ships became helpless, he then gave the order. 35 galleys under Zmajevic's command shot out of the bay, and they then headed to where the ships sent by Vatrang stood. Apraksin followed suit.
Come on now, brothers! Let's move!
Tsar Peter participated in the boarding attack under bullets and cannonballs, alongside the rowers and soldiers. All 10 ships of the Swedish squadron, along with the flagship Elephant, were now in Peter's hands. And thus ended the very first battle in the long history of the Russian Navy. But the Swedish fleet still controlled the entirety of the Baltic Sea. Russian galleys could fight against it only using pirate tactics, capturing, if necessary, 1 or 2 ships when the opportunity arose. But for ultimate victory at sea, what was needed was not only boarding attacks, but large, well-armed ships, as well as extremely experienced and well-trained crews. Upon entering a naval battle, the ships would line up in a single column, and passing by the enemy, they would open fire. They would act as a single unit, maintaining formation and keeping up their rate of fire. This tactic was called line tactics, and it was for this kind of combat that battleships were created. It was the most powerful weapon of the era, the pinnacle of engineering thought.
The ship of the line, the largest of sailing ships, formed the backbone of the regular naval fleet. A 3-masted warship with 2 or 3 gun decks had on average up to 100 guns and a crew of up to 800 people.
After the victory at Gangut, Peter had a new reason to rejoice. Catherine had, at long last, given him a son. The boy was named Peter in honor of his father. This event changed everything. Now the sovereign could actually choose an heir from between his 2 sons. The Tsar decided to send Alexei a final warning. He demanded that he come to his senses and made threats. For I have not spared and do not spare my own life for my fatherland and people. So how can I spare you, worthless one? Soon the answer came. The Tsarevich renounced the throne in favor of his newborn brother. He wrote that he hoped his father would finally leave him alone now. A month after receiving this letter, Peter fell ill. The disease was so dangerous that the senators, awaiting the tragic end, stayed in the royal chambers around the clock. But the crisis passed, and the Tsar, having finally recovered, wrote, "If you actually renounce the throne, you must go to a monastery." For a pretender who had renounced the throne, this was the only path. Fleeing from this fate and his father's wrath, Alexei escaped abroad. Soon, disturbing rumors began to reach Peter. Allegedly, his son was conducting secret negotiations with the military enemy, the Swedes, and planning to overthrow his father and take his place on the throne. The sovereign's worst suspicions were coming true. On Peter's orders, intelligence tracked down Alexei in Naples, and the Tsar's envoys deceived him into returning to Russia. The Tsar expected that his cornered son would throw all his hatred in his face. But he dodged and squirmed, and he shifted all the blame for the betrayal onto his entourage. Well, the mere fact of relations with the Swedish king is enough to condemn the Tsarevich to death. However, the Tsar did not wish to decide his son's fate himself. His sentence was to be passed by a commission that was composed of the highest officials of the state. Peter no longer felt anger or rage. All he really felt was a doomed emptiness in his soul. After the death sentence was passed, Peter's son was imprisoned in the Peter and Paul fortress, and just 2 days later, he died under unclear circumstances. And a year later, not yet 4 years old, Peter and Catherine's son, little Peter Petrovich, died of an incurable disease. It was this death that finally threw the Tsar off balance. His grief was accompanied by terrible convulsive fits. Peter locked himself in his study, and for 3 days he received no one, and he refused any and all food. And in addition to the father's personal grief, there was also a question of national importance. Who would sit on the Russian throne after he was gone? But the Tsar had to hide his feelings. Outwardly, the way of life in the country had not changed at all, and the war with Sweden was approaching a victorious conclusion. At the end of May of the year 1719, near the island of Azov, a Russian squadron consisting of 6 ships of the line was stationed. It was tasked with both finding and neutralizing a Swedish convoy, which was known to be escorting merchant caravans. At dawn on May 24th, observers spotted 3 large ships without flags on the horizon, possibly Swedes. On his flagship Deva Maria, Squadron Commander Captain 2nd Rank Naum Sinyavin ordered all sails to be raised and the pursuit to begin. By evening, the distance finally began to close. Sinyavin gave the order that the crew should prepare for battle.
Before battle, a net was stretched over the deck for protection from falling debris from the masts. The ship's controls were protected from cannonballs with logs and barrels of iron scrap. Sand was scattered on the deck so feet wouldn't slip in the blood. The galley stove was extinguished. The approaches to the powder magazine were covered with damp canvas, and the cabin boys ran quickly to bring charges for the guns from there. All temporary partitions were removed, and the lower gun decks became an open gallery, from the captain's cabin to the ship's bow. Gun ports were opened, and artillery crews loaded and then aimed the cannons.
Drawing ever closer, Sinjavin demanded with 2 shots that they show him their flag. The Swedish banners were then unfurled on the masts. The Russian flagship Devonshire raised a red flag on the foremast, the signal for all ships to engage in battle. Cannonballs smashed the hull planking, tore sails, and broke the rigging. Sharp splinters flew in all directions. But sailors, gunners, and officers did their duty. The deck crew tracked down the grenades, known as lighters, in order to cover them with sand. The medical crew dragged away the wounded, while the ship's doctor operated right during the battle. Portsmouth completely lost control and was immediately attacked by a Swedish frigate and brigantine. Sinjavin on Devonshire broke from the line, made a sharp turn, and opened fire with grape shot, all at close range. A barrage of lead bullets swept away everything alive on deck. The frigate, followed by the brigantine, lowered their flags, while only the enemy flagship was escaping. But only 3 hours later it was caught and forced to surrender. The Russians were able to capture the 52-gun ship of the line Ackmeister, and they also managed to capture the 34-gun Karl Kron Vapin and the brigantine called Berngardos. They captured 387 men, along with Captain Commander Wrangel. About 50 were killed and another 13 were wounded. Russian losses amounted to a total of 9 killed and 9 wounded. Amazingly, the Russian fleet's very first artillery duel ended in its first victory. Sinjavin was showered with a flurry of awards. He was promoted by skipping a rank to captain commander, and he was granted villages in such numbers that he became one of Russia's wealthiest landowners. 3 years later, Naum Sinjavin would receive the rank of Schautbenacht, that is, Rear Admiral. And he would become the first Russian natural admiral, as Peter would call him. As early as the year 1703, with the capture of the fortress of Nynchans, Russian troops established themselves on the shores of the Gulf of Finland. Peter created the imperial standard. On the golden cloth, a black double-headed eagle under 3 crowns held 4 maps in its beak and talons. They were maps of the White Sea, Caspian Sea, Sea of Azov, and Baltic Sea, and they symbolized that henceforth, the Russian Tsar was the lord of 4 seas. The new victory of the Russian fleet over the Swedes at Grengam Island and the signing of the Treaty of Nystad, which ended the Great Northern War, secured the conquered Baltic territories for Russia, the long-awaited access to the Baltic Sea. And 2 months later, Peter accepted the title of Emperor of all Russia from the senators. It was then that Russia became a maritime empire. In just a few years, Peter managed to create a fleet and raise a generation of Russia's first admirals. Once he had dreamed that his sons Tsarevich Alexei and Peter would share his passion for the sea and continue their father's work, but it was not to be. The entire Russian squadron lined up for the parade, which would be viewed by the sovereign emperor himself. But instead of a battleship, a small old boat came to the roadstead, once found in the Izmailovo barn. On board the boat there were admirals of the Russian fleet, including Rear Admiral Peter Mikhailov, His Imperial Majesty. The boat's stern cannon fired a shot with a loud bang, In response, a salute from the main caliber guns thundered over the Baltic. From the boat, the Emperor looked up with his head raised. Leaving the past behind, he looked to the future, to where the sides of the ships he had built rose in the gunpowder smoke.